A plan is now in place to make it easier for farm workers to get that overtime pay, but not everyone's on board. We'll hear from the Farm Bureau on what this change means going forward. Hi everybody and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. The State Labor Department is implementing new regulations regarding farm worker pay. The change comes after a lengthy back and forth over how the decision would impact farms especially. The new plan will decrease the overtime threshold for the next decade. The current threshold for overtime pay is 60 hours. A phased-in gradual reduction will begin January 1st next year, 2024, when the threshold will be 56 hours. It will then decrease by 4 hours every other year until it reaches 40 hours in the year 2032. We're joined now by Jeff Williams, Public Policy Director for the New York Farm Bureau, to give us a little bit more insight on the new overtime threshold and how they're advocating for New York State's farmers and the agricultural industry. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So this is something that's been going on for a while now. The state convened that wage board. From what I understand, this was voted on back in September, if I'm correct, now just getting implemented here. What are your thoughts on it from the Bureau standpoint, and how do you feel this is going to affect our farmers around the state?
Yeah, we've been waiting for this final shoe to fall for quite some time. The wage board voted, as you said, last fall to decrease the hours for overtime on farms down to 40. And the farms have been preparing. This is the last regulatory shoe to drop. And it's now going to be up to farms to try to manage the added costs that could come as a result of this overtime decrease.
So it's a phased-in process here. It now stands at 60. January 1st of next year drops to 56 and then continues to drop 4 hours up until 2032, I believe, when it reaches 40 hours. So does that at least give your farmers some kind of chance to better prepare here, that it's phased in that way?
Sure. I mean, the longer phase-in definitely helps farmers, but New York already is one of the hardest states in the country to do business in, especially when it comes to labor costs. And so this will not help that at all. There is a tax credit that farmers can access to help pay for those overtime costs. But at this point, it's going to be very tough for farmers to compete with our neighbors just to the south in Pennsylvania, where their statutory minimum wage is $7.25. Ours is going to 15. You add that into time and a half, and it adds up to a lot of money in New York State.
I had a chance to speak with the Commissioner of the Department of Labor recently. We were talking about this, and she was kind of talking about when that $15 minimum wage went into effect for, say, fast food industry and restaurants around New York. And a lot of them were, saying the same thing. It was going to be difficult for them to stay in business. And she pointed out that a lot of them have been able to kind of weather the storm, so to speak. And in fact, some of them have even been able to expand. So do you think as we move forward here that maybe this will work itself out and it won't be quite the detriment that farmers think it may be?
Well, I'll tell you, when you walk into a McDonald's or a fast food store, you don't really talk to people anymore. They don't take your order. There's kiosks. So they were able to manage their labor costs by automating. Farmers are going to be forced to do the same thing, but it's going to be far more expensive to do so. It's easier to order a cheeseburger on a kiosk than it is to pick a strawberry with an automatic picker. It's extremely expensive. And so there are labor-saving technologies, but I guess, is that really what the state wants to do, is force people to go to mechanize and then lose jobs for good-paying jobs for workers?
When you look at the folks that do these jobs, and a lot of them are coming into this country and trying to provide for their families, it used to be that they would go back home and cross the border. I mean, that's where the term migrant worker came from. But a lot of them now, Jeff, are living and working right here. Their families are with them, and that money is going right back into the community. So I guess the argument is, why not pay them their fair share like everyone else?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd argue that there aren't as many federal visa workers coming to our farms. There are. Most of our agriculture, when it comes to fruits and vegetables, farmers use the H-2A visa program, so the workers are coming back and forth across the border with a legal visa. It's true that in the dairy industry, the workers are more, working on an annual basis, have housing with their families in some cases, but a lot of that housing, most of that housing, is provided by the farmer. Most of the food is provided by the farmer. So it's not just the wage; it's all the other benefits that the workers get on farms that increase that wage to a much higher level.
Huge industry here in the state of New York, especially across central and upstate New York. The agriculture industry is vast. The biggest concern, of course, is that some of these will go out of business. What have you been hearing from the farmers directly as they begin to prepare for this now?
Yeah, it used to be that the talking points would be farms can't leave, so please don't do this to us. Now we see farms, exploring moving to Texas, to Arizona, to the Southwest, to the Midwest, where the cost of living and the cost of doing business is less. There's a lot of other states out there, they're looking very attractive. And so we didn't used to see that before, but a lot of people are talking about it now.
A lot of advocates who are pushing for free school lunches for kids all over the state of New York. Regardless of income, they want to supply those lunches for free. And one of the components of that bill that's being proposed is to tap in to our farms, to provide that food and tap into that local avenue. Does that give you, is that something you look forward to working on?
Yeah, score one in the good column for that proposal. A rising tide lifts all boats.
Right.
And if we can get more local food into schools, whether it's milk or fresh fruits and vegetables, it's great for the health of our students, but also great for farm sales. We argue that New York City should be buying a whole lot more locally from New York produced food and producers.
So as we anticipate this moving forward over the next decade or so, what is your word for the governor and this administration right now? Now that this is in place, not a lot left to do, but what are you really pushing for now on behalf of our state's farmers?
So much of what we do in New York State when it comes to farming is hand-picked, whether it's apples or vegetables in the field. And so it takes a lot of labor. And so the choices and decisions that policymakers are making now are impacting what New York can and will grow, what farmers can and will grow. Will apple orchards go to solar developments, for example, just because it's easier and you can make more money? Or will vegetable farms go to row crops, corn and soybean, because one person in a tractor can harvest and plant? It's the decisions being made now are taking, the uniqueness of New York agriculture away from New York farms.
Jeff Williams, Public Policy Director for the New York Farm Bureau. Jeff, thank you for the insight. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Public school systems are getting a significant investment from the state this year. When we return, we'll hear from the Executive Director of the Rural Schools Association and get his thoughts on how the multi-billion-dollar plan will help and where it falls short. Remember, if you've got a comment, story idea, please let us know. Email EmpireStateWeekly@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Governor Hochul is proposing a historic $34.5 billion investment in education. She laid out her plan as part of that recent executive budget presentation. One of the most significant items in the proposal is to fully fund foundation aid, which is the main source of funding for public schools for the first time in state history. An additional $250 million has been set aside to establish tutoring programs across the state, including a bunch of money for universal pre-K, but not included in the proposal, free school meals for all students, which districts across the state are lobbying for. All right, joining us now for additional details on the state's education plan, David Little, the Executive Director of the Rural School Board Association here in New York State. David, thanks so much for giving us some time.
Anytime, Ryan.
Coming to us from Texas down there, from what I understand, from the National Superintendent's Conference. So we really do appreciate you carving out a few minutes for us. So I want to get your initial thoughts here on the governor's executive budget proposal as she has laid it out when it comes to education, of course, and she's touting a $2.1 billion increase in state aid, the highest funding level in New York State history.
It is, and it's the final year of the state's plan to finally, after a generation, fully fund foundation aid, which is the basic flexible aid provided on the basis of wealth for each district, so that theoretically our most needy districts get the most aid under foundation aid. And the states had a 3-year plan to try and finally fully fund what they were supposed to provide back probably 15 years ago in a court-ordered settlement to determine whether the state had finally upheld its constitutional responsibility to fund a sound basic education for every child in New York. This is the final year for that. So the plan is theoretically to provide enough money to fully fund that. There are some concerns within the numbers, and of course inflation, and what that increase will actually buy for school districts is also a concern now.
Well, and as an advocate for the smallest districts around the state that I think a lot of people think often get marginalized, maybe think are underfunded from year to year, does this give you some hope as we move forward here?
Well, just on a 1-year basis, for this year, the money that's being provided is all over the place for rural school districts. Some of them are finally getting the money that they've been owed for a generation, and so they're getting a better than average increase. Some of them, in fact, about half of them, are only receiving the minimum 3% increase, which of course is several percentage points below the rate of inflation. When you combine that with the tax cap and the fact that for many of these districts, they don't have a lot of local tax base left, the Great Recession took about 1 million people out of upstate New York and the tax base that went with it. So they're heavily reliant on state aid, and so we need that aid to be able to continue and rebuild the kind of programs that were cut when we weren't getting the state aid that we were owed.
A lot of money she touts too being set aside or hopefully being put into place for universal pre-K and expanding that around the state. Is that something you're hopeful for as well?
It is. We're very mindful of how much money it takes to start these programs. Right. The universal pre-K program is a reimbursement program. So the local district has to pony up the money to begin with, and then the next year the state will provide a percentage of that back. You have to have the money in the first place, and it's very difficult for some school districts under normal circumstances to get that money. Right now it's possible that they can use some of the federal aid that's been provided to do that, and so an expansion of pre-K is very helpful for school districts, and particularly for rural children who have been through such trauma during the pandemic. You know, I always think about, if the pandemic had happened when I was a child, I could still go out in my neighborhood and ride my bike and play ball and those types of things. If you're a rural kid, you're miles away from anybody, without cell service, often without internet service. And so it was solitary confinement for a long time. So trying to get the programs in place that will restore them to where they need to be, that's important for us.
Absolutely, and in that vein, as we come out of being so isolated, right, there's a lot of money that's being put forward to establish mental health programs and clinics within schools. And I would imagine for those smaller, for those rural districts, that would be a big sigh of relief for a lot of people if you're able to get those established, yes?
Mental health is one of our largest concerns. When you think about it, you know, there are children that weren't in school for 2 years.
Yeah.
And so they went directly, some of them went directly from elementary school to high school. That's about the most dramatic way to present some of the challenges that they're facing. So addressing mental health concerns for students right now is of paramount importance. So trying to put those programs and services in place. There are two components of that, of course. You not only need the money, but you need the people. And in rural areas, it's typically very difficult to try and compete with suburban and urban school districts for that kind of staff, whether it's teaching staff or psychological staff, social workers, psychologists, that type of thing.
Finally, David, before I let you go, there's been a lot of talk too about getting meals for every student in the state, regardless of their financial situation, getting that funding in there after the federal dollars dried up from that pandemic relief. I would imagine that's something you'd really like to push for as well.
Well, we really would. It's tremendously helpful if children are coming to school well fed and they're not concerned about that. We all know what it's like to try and focus on something when you really are malnourished. So although for me it's been a while, so I would simply say that there's $250 million in the budget that the governor has said is foundation aid, and she counts that as the amount pushed forward for foundation aid, to say that they're fully funding foundation aid, when in fact it's a categorical tutoring program that must be used for that tutoring program. We would rather see that money used for flexible aid. We'd rather see it for universal meals for kids, and allow each individual school district to determine what best suits the needs of the children in their community.
Well, we've got a long way to go until April 1st, the big budget deadline, of course. A lot of work here still going on behind the scenes. I'm sure you're going to be in Albany quite a bit as we work through that process. David, thank you so much. David Little, Executive Director of the Rural Schools Association here in New York. We appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, guys.
Well, a simple name change has taken a toll on a few New Yorkers, but the Tappan Zee Bridge might be making a return. Will the plan hit any roadblocks? Hear from lawmakers about the possible detours. Remember, if you got a comment or story idea, please let us know. Email EmpireStateWeekly@gmail.com or seek us out on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. The Mario M. Cuomo Bridge that connects Rockland and Westchester counties could be in for a change, and we're not talking repairs. Capitol correspondent Amel Taleji has the details.
The 3.1-mile-long bridge could have its original name reinstated to the Tappan Zee, named after the Native American Tappan people who once lived in the area. In 2017, former Governor Andrew Cuomo renamed the bridge after his late father. Sponsor of the bill, Democratic Senator James Skoufis, says many people who live in the Hudson Valley still call it the Tappan Zee.
This is not about rejecting Mario Cuomo as a former governor and finding some bridge or highway or tunnel to dedicate to him and his service. This is about restoring a name that many people feel was stolen.
Several years ago, the bridge was rebuilt with a $4 billion design known as one of the largest bridge projects in New York history. Could a name change cost taxpayers?
So some signs would have to be replaced. I don't know. It's even possible that the Thruway and the DOT, they still have the old signs. In which case, it would be very easy to just swap them back in. But that would be the only cost.
This same legislation was introduced last year by a Republican senator, but never brought to the floor.
And I don't know why it never made it to the floor, but certainly, I'm in the majority party. He was not. So I'm hopeful that that provides maybe a new opportunity to be able to advance the bill.
Reporting in Albany, Amel Taleji.
All right, to the pushback now on Governor Hochul's plan to decrease the use of fossil fuel-powered heating equipment. While it would end some sales, it is not a ban on gas stoves. And again, this is just a proposal. The governor is vowing to make New York greener by ending the use of fossil fuel-powered heating equipment in new construction by the year 2030. The proposal would ban any new gas lines, again, in new construction, eliminating the use of gas stoves in homes. There would be some exceptions. The proposal would not impact any gas stoves that are currently in use in any homes or businesses.
The reason gas stoves keep coming up now is because there have been some alarming studies that have found that gas stoves contribute to some pretty significant public health impacts. And to boot, our continued reliance upon fossil fuels is driving the global climate crisis and harming public health.
Now, some in New York are concerned the train derailment and fire in Ohio could have impacts here. What environmental officials say they're looking out for. That's coming up. Remember, if you've got a comment or story idea, we'd like to hear from you. Email Empire State Weekly or find us on Twitter. All right, and finally from us here on Empire State Weekly, the NTSB is releasing its preliminary report into what caused that massive train derailment and chemical fire in Ohio. They are citing, right now, mechanical failure. Now, that chemical spill has some concern about potential impacts here in New York, where this happened just about 100 miles from the New York border. The DEC says they are monitoring for any abnormalities in air quality and coordinating their response with the EPA. So far, no human health impacts have been reported here in New York and no anomalies have been detected. The DEC is reminding New Yorkers they can always contact the Department of Health's Bureau of Toxic Substance Assessment with any concerns. The information is right there on your screen. For now, from all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. We'll see you back here next week. Don't forget, you can watch us all over the state. Here's a full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 television stations across New York.